That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We didn't land on the moon. Well, at least, that's what a lot of people still believe. And the reason this story survived, it's more complicated than you might think. Because, you see, in all the photos, the flag looks wrong. The shadows look wrong. I mean, heck, even the sky looks wrong. And for more than 50 years, a handful of strange images, well, they've been enough to make millions of people question one of the biggest moments in human history. So tonight, we're not just asking whether Apollo 11 reached the moon. We're asking how one of the most documented events in history became one of the world's most successful conspiracy theories. Let's retrace the echoes, if you dare. Now, to understand why that doubt hits so hard, you got to go back to a time when America just, wasn't winning when it comes to the space race. I mean, for years, the Soviets beat the United States in nearly every single milestone that seemed to matter. First satellite, first humans in space, first woman in space, heck, even the first spacewalk. Now, by the early 1960s, space, it wasn't about science anymore. It was about power and prestige, military pressure, and, if anything, propaganda with rockets attached. And every Soviet's first, it made America feel like it was running late. Every single launch made it feel like our future was being wrote somewhere else, and that's what makes JFK's moon challenge so very important. You see, Kennedy was not speaking from a position of comfort. I mean, he knew the Soviets was way ahead in the lead, and he knew America, we were playing catch up.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
So instead of chasing the next small win, he pointed the country at the one finish line big enough to change the entire race in one single shot. We're talking about the moon. And at that time, that almost sounded completely insane. I mean, America was so far behind in Russia. They looked unstoppable. And yet, less than a decade later, the United States was prepared to claim the single biggest prize on the entire board. And that is where our story really begins. Because you see, when a country spends years coming in second and then suddenly they claim the biggest win on the entire earth, some people, they don't see a miracle. If anything, they see a motive. Now, the proof was supposed to be simple. I mean, they would watch this whole entire thing happen live, and that was the whole point. Not that just America had gotten it done. You see, the entire world, they'd be able to watch a man being put on the moon, and they would see it with their very own eyes. A moment so big, so final, so undeniable, that no one would be able to argue about it afterwards. But you see, then the pictures, they started coming in, and they did not start feeling so undeniable. If anything, they felt strange. The image was grainy. It was faint. It was almost ghost-like. Not the kind of picture that people imagine would accompany one of the biggest achievements in modern history. And right from the very beginning, the broadcast, it had seams. And we're talking about real ones, the kind that people notice when they're already waiting for proof of, something so monumental, so big. If anything, it kind of felt fragile instead. And at first, when they first started watching it, the picture was upside down.
Have you had a good picture, huh? There's a great deal of contrast in it, and currently it's upside down on our monitor, but we can make out a fair amount of detail.
On the communication loop, Houston asked Goldstone about the reverse switch on the camera because, see, the image had to be flipped on the ground. Now, to engineers, it wasn't a huge deal. This was just if anything, a technical fix. You see, to everyone else, at a minimum, it sounded kind of bizarre. The most important live stream in history began with an image that was backwards. Then, The feed had started shifting between different receiving stations. Goldstone, then Honeysuckle, later Parks. Now the signal was moving between each one of them because the controller was chasing the best possible picture available. Now technically, that makes sense. But to anyone watching from the outside, it can feel like something else completely different. Almost like the image is being selected in real time. Not one clean stream from our history, but a live production being pieced together as the entire world watched. And then for a moment, everything got even stranger. See the picture, it turns out negative. Houston calls it out. Goldstone is told to check the polarity switch. All of a sudden now the image is corrected.
Okay, would you verify the position, the opening I ought to have on the camera? Stand by.
Now it only lasted for just a moment, but you see, moments like that, they matter. Because you see, a conspiracy story, it doesn't need perfection. It just needs itty-bitty cracks in the foundation. And then comes the detail that critics will never let go of. You see, the world wasn't watching a live stream that was coming from the moon straight to their TV set in their living room. The lunar camera was sending a slow scan picture that regular broadcast television, it couldn't air as is. So before the public even saw it, that image had to be converted to something on Earth that networks could use. Now, in plain English, it basically is, what I'm saying is the biggest moment in human history reached the world as a picture of a picture. And you see right there, that's where the mood kind of starts to shift. Because now the question is not what happened. The next question is exactly what are we looking at? We got a blurry image, an upside down start. Then we've got all the stations that's switching around, a negative picture, a signal that had to be converted before the world even saw it. Now, none of that proves that this is a hoax, but if you were already suspicious, it didn't have to. It just had to feel just a little bit off. And years later, when people learned that some of the best original recordings was gone, with that uneasy feeling, it came roaring back, because now it was not just the moment that looked strange, it was proof. This moment right here is when suspicion starts turning into something a little bit more dangerous, because see, blurry footage, a rough broadcast, that's one thing. People can deal with that. A chaotic live stream from 1969, heck, people can even forgive that. But missing the originals? Lost data? Missing the entire telemetry of how the lunar craft got to the moon to begin with? That's something completely different. And you see, conspiracy believers, to them, that's not just being messy. That's the kind of mess that, well, feels convenient. And you see, this is where the story stops sounding like a technical problem and it starts sounding like a cover-up. Because you see, if the moon landing was real, and let me ask you this question, think about it for just a second. If the moon landing was real, then why is the best version of the footage not treated like a crown jewel? Like it was something so prestigious, so important? Why would one of the most important recordings in human history not be preserved, locked down, cataloged, or even untouchable forever? I mean, think about all the things they lost. Instead, what people heard was the complete opposite. That some of the best original material was gone, that the cleanest and most clear source, it was missing. And what the world had been watching all those years, it was not untouched original footage, it was degraded copies, restored versions, rebroadcasts, pieces of other pieces. And for people that was already staring at the footage and thinking something felt off, well, that lands like gasoline on a fire. Because now the story, it writes itself. The image looked strange when it aired, but then the signal was converted for the public. And, the first moments was awkward. It was upside down and then patched between different stations. And later, when people wanted to go back and look at the original footage, the cleanest possible footage of everything, it was gone. That is when conspiracy really begins to breathe. Not because one detail proves it, but because several details, these stack on top of each other. And it starts creating a mood, and moods matter in stories like this. You see, people don't usually fall into a conspiracy because it's one perfect argument. They fall into it because too many things feel wrong, especially when it's in a row. One strange image, missing pieces, one explanation that sounds a little bit too polished, one authority saying, "Trust me, bro," when trust is already kind of running low. And the moon landing? It had something that few stories ever get. It had scale. This wasn't some local mystery, some blurry tape from the edge of town. This was the biggest technological advancement and moment on Earth. A Cold War victory, a national myth, a history-defining event. So once doubt got into the story, it didn't stay small, it spread. I mean, we're talking about books picked it up, late night radio shows picked it up, documentaries, then television specials, VHS tapes, DVDs, then the internet. Then there was clips that was going all over the place, different social media posts. Then the same suspicious frames get passed around again and again and again, each time with a little bit more certainty than the last. And that's what made the moon landing conspiracy so powerful. It didn't need one smoking gun. It just needed enough unsettling details to keep people asking the same question for decades. If the footage looked wrong, if the signal was indirect, if the original material was gone, then maybe the world was never shown history. Maybe it was shown something built to look like history. Maybe it was the biggest performance ever staged. Now, once the broadcast itself felt a little bit strange, people started going back through the images frame by frame. And you see, this is where I believe the conspiracy really kind of found its fuel. It wasn't from one giant revelation. It was from a pile of little small ones. Let's use, for example, the flag on the moon. It was moving even though there's no wind. Shadows that don't seem to line up the way people think it should based on the sunlight. A sky that was so black that it felt empty, with no stars at all. When they would jump around, the footprints, they always looked so clean. And a lunar module sitting on the surface without any kind of crater that people would expect to be, well, if anything, beneath it. And all of that frozen in photographs that, to critics, they look less like history and more like simple mistakes. Now, the flag became one of the most famous examples because if there's no atmosphere on the moon, then a flag, it shouldn't be waving. It should just kind of hang there. But you see in the footage and all the stills, the flag, it doesn't look like it's just still. It looks like it's rippled. It looks like it's, if anything, maybe a little bit caught in motion. And the people who already felt a little bit uneasy about the broadcast, well, that becomes a very easy accusation. If there's no wind on the moon, then why does the flag look like it's moving in the wind? Then comes all the shadows. This one spreads so well because, well, if anything, it feels so simple. I mean, sunlight should cast a very parallel shadow. Go outside, look for yourself. At least that's in the instinct of what should happen. But you see, in all the Apollo images, some shadows seem to angle in very different directions. You got a shadow casting this way, and then you got a shadow casting that way. To critics, that looks more like it's more than one lighting source. Not the sun, but maybe studio lights, much like what I've got here. And you see, once that idea gets planted, well, the moon stops looking like a place and it starts looking more like a movie set. And let's talk about the sky. For a lot of people, this one lands hard because, well, it feels so obvious, if anything. If astronauts was truly standing on the moon under a black sky, then answer this for me. Why was there no stars? Where were they at? I'm not talking about a few. I'm talking about there was none. There was no stars. Now, to conspiracy-minded viewers, that doesn't feel like a technical detail. That feels like a missing backdrop. And then we have things like the footprints. I mean, they looked too perfect, too crisp, too sculptured, especially in a place where there's absolutely no water. In the lunar module, it appears to be sitting on a surface that doesn't have any dramatic blast craters that people would expect to find underneath it. I mean, when it's coming down onto the moon, instead of slamming into the moon, they had to shoot those blasters off. You look at that on Earth, it looks completely different than how it does on the moon. And don't even get me started on the movement of the astronauts. It looks strange to a lot of us, almost, some would say, theatrical, as if the bodies were being slowed down or even suspended. Now, you see, none of these claims had to stand alone. See, that's not how conspiracy stories work. They gain traction through a whole bunch of little things that just don't quite seem to make sense. See, one oddity becomes another, and then another, and then another, until the entire scene, well, it feels wrong. And you see, that's what makes these images so powerful, because they're simple. You didn't need to understand aerospace engineering. You didn't need to understand how their communication systems work. You didn't need to understand how to read the mission transcripts. You just had to look at one photo and say, does this make sense or not? Let's be honest. If you've been on YouTube, you know that a screenshot with a circle and an arrow, that always travels significantly faster than any mission critical notes that you're going to have. Because in this case, the conspiracy had everything that it needed. It had a great story. It was a country that came from behind to win probably the biggest race on Earth, a broadcast that at minimum felt, well, weird, felt awkward, almost indirect. It had original material that, whoops, came up missing, part of the missing tape story, and a gallery of images that to millions of people, well, they look, if anything, wrong at a glance. And you see, once those images took a life of their own, well, the moon landing had stopped being just an event. It became an argument, the kind of story that people could revisit for years and years and point at the same exact frame and say, look at that, tell me that doesn't look like it's fake. And by the time these images started spreading through books and documentaries and late night television, well, the suspicion was no longer just visual, it was voices and authors, and there was theories galore. Now, the story that I just told is the case that the moon hoax believers has been building for decades. We're talking about everything from the flag to the shadows, the missing stars, the strange movement that the astronauts was doing, and even the missing tapes. The feeling that there was too many weird things that was happening in too many places. But you see, this is where the story gets a little bit harder. Because a lot of the claims, they feel powerful at first glance, but they kind of start weakening the second that you start asking some of the, well, some would say boring questions. Like, let's take the flag, for example. This is probably one of the most famous arguments when we talk about the entire moon landing debate. If there's no atmosphere on the moon, well, then why is the flag moving? And in the footage, it does look like it, if anything, that it moved. Now, the skeptical answer is, well, you got to define the word move. There was a flag that was mounted on a horizontal support and twisted during the setup, which left it looking rippled instead of like it was hanging flat. So what people read as wind, it might not have been wind at all. It may have just been fabric holding the shape it was forced into. And then there are the shadows. Now, this one sounds devastating until you remember that with photographs, they flatten space. Critics look at the Apollo images and say, well, the shadows, they don't line up. It must be from multiple lighting sources, much like what I'm using today. It has to have been shot in a studio. Now, the skeptical answer is a little bit less cinematic. They talk about things like uneven ground, camera angle, lens perspective, and reflected light that can make shadows that look like they should be parallel, look like they're maybe spreading apart a little bit. In fact, in the world of cinematography, we use things to bounce light all the time, and it creates its own shadows themselves. Then there's the sky. No stars, just black. Now, to a lot of people, that still feels like one of the strongest points. If astronauts was really standing on the moon, then why is the sky so, well, empty? The skeptical answer is exposure. The cameras were set up for brightly lit astronauts and reflective lunar surfaces that was creating some of the shadows we was talking about earlier. It's not set up for faint background stars, so the stars, they wouldn't show up in those settings. Now, the problem is not the sky, it's the assumption that cameras can see the same way that we as humans are able to see. Here's a great thing to also think about. When you're standing inside of a bright house and it's dark outside, when you go outside, you don't automatically see stars. Your eyes have to adjust to see them. Next, you have the footprints. Now, critics say they look too clean, too sharply formed, especially in a place where there's no moisture. But that assumes that moisture is what gives the material its shape. Now, skeptics point out that the lunar dust is made of this extremely fine and somewhat jagged particles that compact differently than what a loose, dry sand would on Earth. So the perfect footprint's not necessarily evidence that anything was faked. It might just be evidence that moon dust, it reacts differently than how we would expect things here on Earth. I mean, we use examples such as dirt or soil, sand, and look at how each one of those are different here on Earth. Who's to say that there's not something that we've not experienced because we're not on the moon? One of the big things that I typically have thought about when it comes to the moon landing is the missing crater underneath the lunar module. Now this one, it sounds extremely strong to people like myself. We all imagine this dramatic rocket blast carving a deep crater into the surface, but see, the skeptical answer is way more simple. The descent, it had engines that was throttling on and off. They say the moon didn't react the way that people would imagine that it should. The absence of a giant crater, it might feel visually, if anything, disappointing, but disappointment is not inherently evidence. And then there's the movement. When we talk about the astronauts' movement, to conspiracy believers, some astronauts, their movement looked at a minimum unnatural, almost like it was wire work or slowed film. We see it all the time in movies, but skeptical responses is that people are watching 1/6 gravity through bodies that was trained entirely on how things work here on the Earth. What looks odd is not automatically fake. Sometimes it's just we're unfamiliar. Prime example, if you've never been on a skateboard before, if you watch someone that skateboards, it's beautiful. But if you yourself have never been on a skateboard before, you're going to look a lot more clumsy. Case in point, the same thing with these astronauts. Unfamiliar movement, especially in grainy footage. I mean, people are already distracted. It can start to look theatrical, even when it's not. And that leads to the biggest skeptical point. A lot of the strangest moon hoax claims are not really engineering arguments. They're typically about the images and the videos and the things that we expect as normal people here on Earth to look at and go, you know what, that doesn't look quite right. Then you have people from science that's trying to explain it and we go, that doesn't make sense. It's because we don't truly understand exactly how everything's supposed to be. In fact, we assume that the moon should look normal to us based on what we see day to day here on Earth. Many of the younger people, they assume that old television should look way cleaner. They assume that unfamiliar physics, they should feel familiar. They assume that if an image looks wrong, that the events behind it, well, that must be wrong too. Now, from the skeptical point of view, the Apollo hoax case, it doesn't collapse because people stopped asking questions. It collapses because the most famous questions, well, they were never as strong as what they sounded to begin with. Now, those that believe we never landed on the moon, I'm going to give you a voice on this episode also, because for people who still believe that there's something wrong with the Apollo 11 mission, well, the skeptical explanations that they just gave in the last section, they don't kill the entire case. They just explain little bits and pieces of it. See, that's the difference. Believers don't need to believe in one little thing, such as a shadow or the flag and how the flag's moving, or even the missing star. The stronger version of the argument's always the whole event, and if it carries some type of a weight. And you see, there's too many technical oddities, too many things where things are moving that doesn't make sense when you look at it from those that believe that we never landed on the moon. From their point of view, it's never about one photo that looks fake. It's that the story always seems to need an explanation. I mean, think about it. The flag has an explanation for why it's moving the way it's moving. The shadows have an explanation. The stars had an explanation. The movement that each one of the astronauts had, it had an explanation. The tapes, being missing, that needed an explanation. We didn't even cover it on this episode, but the lost technology. NASA will tell you we can't even do the same mission we did now because they lost all the technology of how we got there to begin with. And then there's the Van Allen radiation belts. They have an explanation for that too. And to believers, the pattern, it matters. Because see, once a story needs that many defenses, it stops feeling, if anything, self-evident. It starts to feel fragile. Like the official version only works if everyone already trusts what we're being told. And you see, that's where the deeper mistrust comes in. You see, for believers, the moon landing's not just about photographs or physics. It's about institutions, governments, Cold War pressure, national prestige, the possibility that the biggest symbolic victory on Earth may have mattered too much to fail. The motive, it never really goes away. In fact, for believers, it gets stronger the more impossible the mission sounds. Because if America spent years trailing the Soviets, then suddenly reached the single biggest milestone first, some people, they don't see it as proof of victory. They see motive. And you see, once motive's on the table, well, every strange detail kind of starts feeling heavier. Then there's a trust problem. And you see, this is one reason that the moon landing conspiracy has survived for so long with so many people. A lot of people don't approach it as a technical puzzle. If anything, they approach it as, well, a credibility test. See, their thinking is pretty simple. If powerful institutions have lied to us before, and trust me, I could name many occasions where that's happened. If they covered things up before, if they manipulated images before, heck, the images that we see from NASA now, they're all manipulated. NASA will tell you themselves, just look on the images, they'll tell you that the images are manipulated. If all of that is true, then why should this case get automatically trust just because it's historic? See, from the believer's point of view, skepticism is not irrational, it's earned. And you see, that's what makes the Apollo story much harder to settle than people would expect, because now it's not about people arguing about what happened in 1969. They're arguing about whether people should still believe giant institutions at face value. And this is a much bigger fight. Believers also focus on the emotional texture of the case, not just what the footage shows, but the whole thing and how it feels. The blurry broadcast, the strange visual qualities, the missing original material, the later explanations, the sense that every problem already has an answer that's waiting for it. To a believer, that doesn't feel like a case that's getting stronger. It feels like a case that's being, well, maintained. And that is why the conspiracy survives any of the skeptical review. Not because the skeptical side has no answers, but because the believers hear those answers and they still walk away with the same thought. Maybe that explains this piece. Maybe explains that one and that piece over there. But why does all this still feel so wrong? That's the believer's position at its strongest. Not, I have one perfect smoking gun. It's more like, I don't buy that this many strange things can just continue to stack up around the biggest event in modern history and still mean nothing. And once somebody reaches that point, the case, it becomes very hard to unwind, because now there's no longer looking for just proof, they're looking for confirmation. And every old anomaly, every missing tape, every awkward frame, every clipped interview, every contradiction they think they've heard, all of it starts feeding the same idea. And for believers, that's the detail that never goes away. Not that every answer is wrong, that the story still sounds like something that needs protecting. So where does all this leave us? On one side, you got the skeptical point of view. The flag, the shadows, the stars, all that can be explained. Even the movement of the astronauts can be explained. The strange broadcast chains, the missing tapes that, well, they sound a whole lot less sinister when you strip away all the drama. From that point of view, the moon landing hoax, it survives for the same reason that a lot of conspiracies do truly survive. A strange image spreads faster than a technical explanation. A suspicious mood is easier to remember than a system breakdown. And once enough people decide that something just feels wrong, they start treating it like it's evidence. But then again, on the other side, the believers, they never really walk away satisfied because, see, to them, this isn't whether each anomaly has an answer, it's more about a pattern. Too many strange visuals, too many awkward moments, too many explanations that arrive way after the fact, too much trust required in institutions that, for a lot of people, they no longer get that trust automatically. And you see, this is why the story never truly dies, because the skeptic side, they always ask, can these details be explained? But for the believers, it's always, why does a moment this important need to be explained at all anyways? You know, maybe the weirdness is just technical. Maybe it's the scar tissue of old TV sets and old cameras and missions that seem so huge even by today's standards that they almost look unreal. Or maybe the reason the story still feels haunted is because something about it was never really clean to begin with. See, that's the real tension. Not whether men walked on the moon, but what kind of proof people are willing to trust when the event itself almost feels too big to believe. Because you see, the Apollo 11 was either one of the greatest achievements in human history or one of the greatest performances ever staged. And maybe the reason the people still argue about it to this day is because both versions of the story say something uncomfortable about us as humans. See, one says that humans can do the impossible, and the other side says that humans can lie about the impossible and keep lying for generations. So now I want to hear from you. When you look at the footage, the photographs, the missing pieces, the explanations, all of the doubt, the mythology around it all, what do you see? Do you see a victory? Do you see deception? Or a story so big that people will never stop fighting over it? Let me know in the comments down below. I truly want to know. I want to know how many people believe that we landed on the moon and those that did not. But until next time, keep looking up.